This is part 3 of my personal journey. At the end of part 2, I had moved to Alachua in January 1993, and regarding this Rtvik Guru issue, for years I was mostly trying to avoid it. For 8 months in late 1995 until the summer of 96, I went back to the LA temple to again upgrade the control system for the museum there. While I was there, a devotee gave me literature supporting the Rtvik RAS path. The GBC had been warning devotees not to read that literature, calling it poisonous. Still, I've always been philosophically inclined and an independent analytical thinker on a philosophical issue like this. I would never be satisfied just being told that some idea is wrong without knowing what that philosophy is myself. Since the papers were being given to me, I thought I should look into this myself and see what their arguments were. If the Rtvik representative after samadhi issue was truly bogus, I needed to know what their arguments were so I could defeat them on my own, for my own realizations based on my own reasoning and logic deduction. So I took the literature with the idea of finding out what their message really was. I mean, I was open somewhat to see maybe they do have the right message, because there was a lot of things going wrong with the current system in ISKCON. But I'll say if it was not, if it was truly bogus, as the GBC were saying, I needed to know what their points were, what their philosophy was, so I could, if need be, I could try to defeat that myself. Within their literature, the first thing, because I was thumbing through, the first thing that I saw was the July 9th letter. Even though that letter was featured in articles in the Vedic Village Review 10 years earlier, I just never read it, you know. And I had never gotten the opportunity, actually, otherwise, to read it for myself until now, the summer of 1996, 19 years after Srila Prabhupada had signed it. Since 1978, the only thing the GBC was saying about this letter, or it was originally called the list, was that it not only contained the names of the 11 new gurus, but in that letter, Srila Prabhupada instructed those 11 men to become gurus. In March of 1978, the GBC published an official paper entitled The Process for Carrying Out Srila Prabhupada's Desires for Future Initiations. That paper was handed out to all of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, or at least it was in Los Angeles, and it was supposed to have been in all the temples. It was a most important document, as it gave the foundation of what would become the multi-guru system in ISKCON. At the time, I understood the historical significance of that paper, and so I saved it and kept it with me, and still have it today, 43 years later, at the time I am making this video. And here it is. Here is a copy of that paper. I don't know if you can tell it on the video, but it's a little bit yellowed with age. So, I mean, I still kept it for 43 years. In this official paper, in reference to the May 28th meeting, the paper stated, and I quote, "The GBC members met together in Vrindavan and prepared a few last questions to put before Srila Prabhupada. One very important question was how disciples would be initiated in the parampara after the departure of His Divine Grace. When asked this question, Srila Prabhupada replied that he would name some persons who would initiate disciples after his disappearance. We then asked him who the spiritual master of such disciples would be. He replied that the new initiators would be the disciples of those whom he empowered to initiate, and that he, Srila Prabhupada, would be their grand spiritual master. He then said that he would name the initiating gurus later." And end of quote. In reference to the July 9th letter, or the list, the GBC paper stated, and I quote again, "On naming these disciples, he ordered that they become Ritvicacharyas, which means that they were to initiate disciples on his behalf. He indicated, as he had said, now this is important, he indicated, as he had said in May, that these Ritvicacharyas named by him would, after his disappearance, continue as initiating spiritual masters. He named 11, but said the number could be increased in the future." End of quote. When I got this paper, and for some reason, those two sections, those two paragraphs that I just quoted, or sentences, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, they stood out in my mind. And actually they etched in my memory. Not the exact words, but I remember especially this last one. That it states, the GBC stated, that it was in that letter, that July 9th letter, that Srila Prabhupada were giving the names of the 11 men who were to become Ritviks first, but that it stated in that letter the same as Prabhupada had stated in May, at the May meeting, that on his disappearance, these men would become initiating gurus. So that's what the GBC told us. That's what they wrote in their formal official paper. They wrote and stated that it was in that July 9th letter that Srila Prabhupada also said the same thing as he had said in May, that these Rtvik acharyas named by him would, after his disappearance, continue as initiating spiritual masters. There are many flaws and outright misleading statements in this paper. First of all, note that there are no direct and explicit quotes by Srila Prabhupada given in this paper. The only thing the GBC write here is to say that Prabhupada said. The GBC say that Prabhupada said this. He said that. They give no direct quote as verification that this was exactly what he said, clearly and explicitly. This has been the case when the GBC present their views regarding this issue for the past 43 years. No quotes of what Srila Prabhupada actually said. No written papers are given, signed by His Divine Grace, where he stated these things in writing. All we get is that the GBC say he said this and instructed this. I will go into detail and explain why that is so in the chronological timeline section of this presentation, but the bottom line is that the GBC do this simply because Srila Prabhupada never explicitly and clearly gave any such instructions, either verbally or in writing, regarding these things on this issue that the GBC say he said. The GBC have only construed what they think he said or what they think he wanted to say. What they did is they took copied fragments of what he said from here and from there, while leaving out a lot of the most important statements he made, and pasted those fragments together and concluded that the copy and pasted fragments is what he was actually trying to say. Again, this will be detailed, how this came about, in the chronological timeline section. And I'm not saying they did it on purpose, as it will be brought out in that paper. They misunderstood, and it was done from that misunderstanding. It was a mistake. But for now, let's examine a few of the statements this 1978 GBC paper made. I quote, Srila Prabhupada replied that he would name some persons who would initiate disciples after his disappearance, end of quote. In the chronological timeline section, I will carefully analyze what Srila Prabhupada actually said in that meeting, what his actual response was to the question they asked about how initiations would be conducted after he departs. This statement here in the 1978 GBC paper is just wrong. It's totally misleading. When Srila Prabhupada was asked this question, how initiations would be conducted after he departs, he stated that he would select some of the GBC men to act as officiating acharyas. He was asked, are those the Ritviks? Rtvik acharyas, and Srila Prabhupada said, Rtvik, yes. And they would initiate on Prabhupada's behalf. He never said they would actually be actual gurus. He just said Ritviks. He would name some people to be Ritviks. Then separately, because he saw the GBC were wanting to know, the men there were wanting to know, when could they be gurus? They were wanting to know about, because they asked about who's the real guru. So then Prabhupada understood. They want to know when they can be gurus. So then Prabhupada separately spoke about how there will be actual gurus. He said that on my order, but by my order, when I order, that person will become an actual guru. And the actual guru will then initiate his own disciples. Then they were asking, well, what is that person, how they initiate, are that the real guru? Yes, that'll be the real guru. I'll be the grand spiritual master, the men they initiate. But that is a separate entity. Prabhupada had already been asked about the initiations after he departs, and he said, I will soon select some of you to act as the Ritviks. Then, well, who's the actual guru? Then Prabhupada understood they're asking about themselves when there will be guru. So Prabhupada then separately said, on my order, become actually a guru, but when I order, but by my order. So, and he made it clear that that was just by his order. There were two separate. However, the GBC men in that meeting misunderstood. They mistakenly thought that Srila Prabhupada was speaking about one and the same group of entities, that the Ritviks who he would name would become actual gurus. And how the GBC came about doing that, they just construed this, because what they did is they copied fragments from his statement about the Ritviks and copied fragments about his statement about those who he would order to become actual gurus, and they pasted those fragments together and they said, here, this is what Srila Prabhupada said. This pasted together fragments from these basically two separate topics or subtopics. Again, all of this will be explained in detail in the chronological timeline section. Another thing stated in this paper was, and I quote, he said that he would name the initiating gurus later. Well, again, obviously wrong. I just explained that. What he said was that he would select, when he was asked that question, that he would select men who would act as officiating acharyas, Ritviks. By the way, and I'll explain this in the chronological timeline, the word officiating, Prabhupada has used in his purports in his Srimad Bhagavatam several places, as like when Indra was gone from his post, another demigod officiated on his behalf. When Yamaraj was gone from his post, another sage officiated on Yamaraja's behalf. So an officiating acharya would be someone who would officiate on the acharya's behalf, especially when you bring in the Ritvik aspect. So anyway, that again we'll get to in the chronological timeline. But Prabhupada never said that he would soon give names of those who would become initiating gurus. He only said who will become Ritvik representatives. How the GBC misunderstood that, again, I explained that, because there is reasons how they came to that misunderstanding, and I will explain how they came to that misunderstanding, where they actually started to get off on this issue. It's documented. There is actually proof, and I will provide that proof and show where the GBC started to get off on this issue and started misunderstanding what Srila Prabhupada was actually stating and saying on this issue. Also stated in this official 1978 GBC document, it says that Srila Prabhupada, when he gave the list of names, which was the July 9th letter, that he stated in that letter the same thing that he had stated in the May 28th meeting, and that was that those who he selects as Ritviks will become actual gurus after his disappearance. Now here's the statement. Quote, on naming these disciples, my insertion in here is that that is referring to the July 9th letter where Srila Prabhupada named those disciples. End of my insertion. Back to the quote. So on naming those disciples, he ordered that they become Ritvik acharyas, which means that they were to initiate disciples on his behalf. He indicated, as he had in May, my insertion, the May 28th meeting, back to the quote, that these Ritvik acharyas named by him would, after his disappearance, continue as initiating spiritual masters. And end of quote. This document is stating that what Srila Prabhupada stated in writing in the July 9th letter was the same thing that he had verbally instructed in the May 28th meeting, and that was that these Ritviks would automatically become actual gurus on his disappearance. It was that statement given in this 1978 paper that for some reason left a really big impression in my mind. I'm not sure why, but it like got etched into my memory. It's most likely because there were nowhere in this paper was given an actual quote as to what Srila Prabhupada actually said. They didn't quote Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada said, or they said Prabhupada said, but there is no quote to what he said. And so the closest thing to a verifying statement was that the GBC claimed that Srila Prabhupada had verified himself in writing that when he gave the list of these 11 men, that he said the same thing as he had verbally said in the May 28th meeting. So that was the closest thing to a verification. But it was still just the GBC telling us what was said and what was written. Again, they gave no quotes, and they did not even provide the July 9th letter for us to see. That's a whole other topic, which I get to in the chronological timeline again. So I kept this paper since that day that it was handed to me in March of 1978. And for 19 years, I had come to accept what it had stated there. That when Srila Prabhupada gave the list of 11 men, which was a July 9th letter, that he stated the same thing as he had said in the May 28th meeting, and that these Ritviks were to become actual gurus on his disappearance. This statement formed the basis for me to leave no other choice except to accept that this was the system that Srila Prabhupada actually wanted. Fast forward now to 19 years later, the spring of 1996, and in all of those 19 years, I'm reading the July 9th letter, the list, for the very first time. I could not believe what the letter stated. Actually, I couldn't believe what the letter did not state. Nowhere was any mention that these men would have become regular gurus then or at any other time in the future. Especially, there was no mention of on his disappearance. All that was written in the letter was that they were to become Srila Prabhupada's Ritvik representatives and that Srila Prabhupada will be the initiating guru. A description of how the Ritvik representative system of initiations will be conducted is given, and it stated that that was to be the system to be followed henceforward, and that was it. That was all he wrote in that letter where he gave the list of the 11 men. There is no mention at all of these men ever becoming regular gurus and initiating their own disciples. There is no mention at all of changing their Ritvik position or changing the system that Srila Prabhupada gave in that letter on his disappearance. My initial gut reaction was that it was probably likely similar to that of many other Prabhupada disciples when they read this letter for the first time. My initial gut reaction was that the GBC had been purposefully lying to us since 1978. They either lied or they knowingly tried to make misleading statements, or they were just incompetent and told us something by mistake that just wasn't true. Either way, what their official GBC paper stated on this most important topic was wrong and misleading. My immediate reaction was that the Ritvik representative of the Acharya system, those supporters, they must be right. Srila Prabhupada did only want a Ritvik system, and the GBC are either gravely mistaken or they're just outright lying to us. Why would their 1978 official paper state something so misleading and so obviously wrong?